Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me. We talk about faith and politics and all kinds of topics that really matter in our culture. So if you're tired of all the screamers out there taking all the oxygen out of the room and you want to join us in taking some of that space back, you'll love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill and good faith. And if you appreciate what we're doing here, I'd ask you to consider supporting us on Patreon. It's really easy to find us, patreon.com/politicsandreligion. The end is spelled out, patreon.com/politicsandreligion. It's how we keep the lights on, and it really helps us continue to have conversations like the one we're having today with David Clary. David Clary is an award-winning author and news editor at the San Diego Union-Tribune. Clary's latest book is Soul Winners, The Ascent of America's Evangelical Entrepreneurs, which we'll be discussing at length today. His previous book, Gangsters to Governors, The New Bosses of Gambling in America, explores how and why states have encouraged and promoted the expansion of legalized gambling in America. Widely awarded work, his last book, as I'm sure this one will be too. And interestingly, that book on gambling in America was cited 5 times in the U.S. Supreme Court's majority opinion that struck down the federal ban on sports gambling in May of 2018. Before joining the Union-Tribune in 2002, David worked in a variety of editing and design roles at the Plain Dealer in Cleveland. He is a native of Central New York and studied journalism and PoliSci at Syracuse University, an orange man, but we won't hold that against you. David, thanks so much for joining us. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much, Corey, for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. So before we get into the book, I have lots of questions. I did want to ask you about your dad, Hal Clary. You describe how, as a kid, you'd often get into conversations, sometimes disagreeing, but never disagreeable, as he said. Is he the one that inspired you to get into journalism and spark your interest in politics and social issues?
Yeah, and I love this podcast because this is exactly like our dinner time conversations. We talked about religion and politics, the two things you're not supposed to talk about and around the dinner table. But my dad was fascinated by politics. He had a library full of presidential biographies, and we loved talking about it. We disagreed, at times, and he also was a man of faith. I'm not an evangelical. I was raised Catholic, and my dad was a devout Catholic. So we discussed, the Catholic faith, and we also had disagreements about that. So religion and politics was always intertwined in our household. I mean, that was something we talked about all the time. Not only my immediate family, but my extended family, who are mostly Republicans, and I'm not a Democrat either. I'm not part of a party, but I would often like to debate people, my family, about politics and their points of view, and we never. It was never disagreeable. We would just agree to disagree on certain points and move on. So I think that's always been with me, and I think working as a journalist for 26 years now, politics is so embedded in what we do every day, and so I read dozens of stories every day about American politics, and I continue to. I'm a Catholic to this day. I still go to church, but I've always been interested in evangelicals. My grandmother actually was Catholic, and she became a Pentecostal. And when I was 8 years old, I went with her to a Pentecostal service, and my dad wasn't too thrilled about that. But I was just curious because we talked a lot about the Bible and Jesus and the afterlife, and I just was so fascinated by that. So we went. She took me to this Pentecostal church, and it was charismatic, and it was speaking in tongues, and there was everybody got handed a tambourine and we're all playing tambourines. It was very unlike any Catholic service you'd ever go to. And I was really struck by the emotionalism of the service and how dedicated everybody seemed. When you go to a Catholic service, it's very regimented and everybody's very quiet, and there's a certain order of things, and you're not to raise your voice. But so that always stuck with me, that experience going to that church, just seeing it firsthand, the real dedication that evangelicals have. And unfortunately, my grandmother passed away about a year or two after, so I didn't get to go to many more services with her. But so I've always been so fascinated by religion and why people believe in what they believe in, and the effect it has on the public square. Private beliefs, religious beliefs, do have an effect on the public arena. So the intersection between the religion and politics has just always been a fascination for me.
Yeah. No, we'll certainly get into that. And your book is a great investigation into how the two intertwine, not just here in recent history, but over the course of the history of the U.S. But I wanted to ask you something else. It looked like I was trying to date your career, and it looked like you were getting specifically into newspaper journalism, just as that part of the industry was really being challenged and like everything was going online. I'd love for you to tell us more about your own professional journey and how you've been able to navigate like those ups and downs of the business over the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, there have been many ups and downs. That's a great question. And ever since I was little, I was always interested in, I always liked to read the New York Times when I was in middle school. I'm one of the very few kids that his interest was just fascinated by newspapers and Time magazine. We got that at the house. And I really, ever since I was in high school, all I wanted to be was to work in journalism. That's all I wanted to do. And I'm fortunate. I'm one of the few that I've been able to do that my entire career. And unfortunately, we have gone through many rounds of layoffs and buyouts and ownership changes. So it's been a real rocky road. I've been with the same newspaper now for 20 years, which is unusual. So I could write a whole book about maybe my next book would be about the changing business of journalism, because there's a lot fewer journalists now, and I think we get into this. Journalists generally they see this career as a calling. It's in a way it might be similar to religion. People, why they get into religion. I think journalists really feel like this is a calling. We could be doing other things with our career and maybe find a career that's more stable and has better hours and better pay for many of us. But I think we do it because we think it's a mission. For us, it's a mission for us to pursue the truth, and with fairness and with rigor. That's really what all I've ever wanted to do, and that's all I really know how to do. So, yeah. And then writing these books is just something I've been an editor my whole career, but I've always loved writing ever since I was little, and this gives me an opportunity to do writing on the side and have and exercise that part of my brain, and I enjoy researching. I enjoy doing interviews, and that's just not something I do in my actual job. So this has been a great way for me to explore more of my abilities and strengthen my abilities. And especially I worked on this Soul Winners. I wrote a lot of it during the pandemic when there was nothing else to do. I had a fair amount of research already done. I had started writing it, but the easiest thing to do in the world is to find an excuse not to write. And because there's always something going on. I have a family, and there's always a game to go to or some errand to run. But when the pandemic hit, there really was nothing else to do. Just you're home all day, other than taking a walk around the neighborhood. So I actually got a lot of writing done. It was one of the few things I could control, during the pandemic, because so much was out of our control. What stores were open, what work wasn't open. I had to work remote. So it was something I could control, and it kind of saved me in a way, I think, to have something to concentrate on. Some people learned how to bake sourdough bread. Other people learned, kind of rediscovered some of their hobbies, because it was an opportunity where everything slowed down, and you're able to concentrate on something that you could control and enjoy.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay. So the book is Soul Winners, The Ascent of America's Evangelical Entrepreneurs. So first, can you just describe for us what an evangelical entrepreneur is?
Sure, and there's many ways of looking at evangelicals. I mean, it's such a large, complicated
Yeah.
group, and I think a lot in the media is to blame for some of this. I think sometimes we do oversimplify evangelicals and just see everybody as one big block, and it's a very complex, diverse group. I mean, you've got you have very very different traditions and styles. The way I kind of see, and like I said, there's many ways you can look at it. Like I've seen there's been a lot of books written about looking at evangelicals through the prism of race, or through the prism of politics or gender, and those are all really good ways of approaching it. And I just felt like the more I studied evangelicals, the more I could see that they were really at the core of them. They're really entrepreneurs. Many of them are not denominational. They strike out on their own. They're left to succeed or fail on their own, like any entrepreneur is, and they take chances. They develop their own order of service. Many of them don't have to answer to a higher authority. In America is such an entrepreneurial culture. In our Constitution, we do not have an established religion, unlike many other countries. So that really gives an opening to entrepreneurs who are able to find a market and then cater to it. And that's what evangelicals have done so well, in the whole course of American history. So that really stuck out at me as like, I just really thought it could be helpful to look at evangelicals through their entrepreneurial lens, and that once I did that a lot of these pieces started to fall into place for me, and a lot of things make sense. When you're an entrepreneur, you're very individualistic, and you strike out on your own, and you're sometimes suspicious of collective action, and you're very much of you pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of mentality, and that's very close to the heart of evangelicalism. Evangelicals have a very individual relationship with Jesus. That's a strong strain that I see in it. So I just thought that was a very useful way of understanding the movement and where it's going.
So, but by any chance, did you read Pete Wehner's account of it just came out yesterday. There's like this tour that Michael Flynn is the main speaker.
The Reawaken tour.
Yes.
Yeah, I've read about the tour, and I have read Pete's work on recently.
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily about Pete's piece about it, but the tour itself. As I was reading your book, I read Pete's piece about it, and it just struck me that this is today's version of a lot of what you described, even going back to Dwight Moody, a couple hundred years ago. But this is some descendant of that. This is what we have today. So that's why I asked you about it.
Yeah. No, there are definitely historical echoes, and that's one value of looking at the whole history of a movement.
Yeah.
So a lot of these books start out, in the 70s or the 80s in the Reagan era, or they just focus on the Trump era, and I think you really need to go back a lot further. And when you do that, you do see a lot of those historical echoes, where you see someone like you mentioned, Dwight L. Moody, Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday was popular 100 years ago.
Yeah,
and when you read his sermons and his approach, it's if you put a thumb on his name, you would think it could be a modern day prosperity gospel preacher. I mean, he was extremely very pro-American and very individualistic, and he didn't like social service. He actually was anti. And then if you go after Sunday, many of these conservative preachers were very against the New Deal. They were against the Great Society. They were against a lot of the civil rights movement legislation of the 60s, and you really see the threads as you go forward. There was a large Jerry Falwell was at the vanguard of a very anti-gay movement in the 1970s and into the 80s, and then now you're seeing And you saw the fights against the same-sex marriage, and now you're seeing the fights against the transgender rights. I mean, these things that just echo throughout history, and they take some different labels, but they're the same thing.
Yeah,
It's the same message that gets recycled, generation after generation. I just found that so fascinating.
Well, to your point, you had me right out of the gate. The epigraph is from Billy Sunday, who's
right.
He's a leading leading evangelist in the early 20th century. So he said, "There is but one rule: win souls for Jesus. This is what is so gripping. Any tactics that produce the general result are good tactics. A good is wrought, therefore the methods employed cannot be wrong." And it really, so that's what he said. And it really resonated. Later in the book, you recount something that Franklin Graham was talking about. I think I might be wrong about this. I think it was in response to somebody who was asking him about January 6th, or what was it? Oh no, it was pandemic. It was he was responding to something about pandemic where, okay, we'll set up tents in New York City, but people who work there have to affirm their faith in Jesus Christ and certain affirmations, even about gay marriage or something like that.
Yeah, Franklin Graham is such a fascinating character. I went to one of his rallies in San Bernardino last year. Thousands of people attended, and he has such an interesting dichotomy where he does a lot of. There's no question he does lots of good work. He's in charge of Samaritan's Purse, which is what you're referring to in New York City. They do work all across the globe, and when there's a natural disaster, they're there, and so there's no question he does good work. But then there's that other side of him there always seems like there's a string attached to that. That okay, I'm doing this good work, but if you don't sign this declaration that you're opposed to same-sex marriage, then you can't volunteer. And during this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and he's also extremely political. You see him on Fox News. You see him, and he's an ardent conservative. And it's interesting when you contrast him with his father, who he was very close with Eisenhower, a Republican, but he also was very close with Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat. But Billy Graham was burned very badly during the Nixon years. He was caught on tape making anti-Semitic remarks.
Yeah.
He clung to Nixon until the very, very end of Watergate. And Billy Graham really stepped away from partisan politics because I think he just felt like he flew too close to the sun. And which is interesting because that was the time when evangelicals were really pushing toward partisan politics in the late 70s with Jerry Falwell and some of those figures. Billy Graham actually was receded from the real hard-edged political views, and he actually became a little more moderate on some issues as he got older. But his son Franklin has gone the other way. He's become more hard-edged about partisan politics, and I don't know if you follow his Twitter feed, but it's extremely partisan.
Yeah, no, I do. Yes, I do. So you don't have to. No, one of the things I was really curious about, the book is such a deep dive and really in depth, wide ranging, goes way back, but also covers a lot of the contemporary figures. As you described yourself, you're a person of faith, but not an evangelical. Right. I was curious how you put together such a detailed portrait of all of this.
Yeah, it was really difficult for me to. There's so many interesting characters, the evangelical world, especially now, and it was one of the biggest challenges of this book was who to leave out, because if I wrote about every major evangelical leader, this would be a 600-page book, and I didn't have the appetite or the ability to do that. So I tried to focus on the ones that seemed like they were the most entrepreneurial, and the ones that were the most that kind of reflected the themes of the book the best. So I wrote about Kenneth Copeland, who he's been around a very long time. He was Oral Roberts' pilot back in the 50s and 60s, and Copeland is a prosperity gospel preacher. He has a compound outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and he has a private airport, and he has a mansion which he uses his parsonage exemption to pay for that. And he has television ministry, and he's also a very hard-edged conservative. He's a fascinating character, and I think one of the questions people ask me, friends and colleagues, as I was doing this book, is why do people give him money? Why are people like him money? And it's actually a calling card for these people to have a private jet. Copeland asked his followers for money so he could upgrade his private plane. He's a Gulfstream 5. That's worth probably about $20 million. And he actually put up a video on YouTube saying, you paid for this Gulfstream 5. Isn't this marvelous? And, oh, God is blessing us so abundantly. And but I think Americans see that, or his followers see that, and they see, oh, well, this is a down home kind of guy, and look at where he's living in a mansion and he's rich, and I can be rich too if I follow him, and I can, we live in such an aspirational culture in America, and I think people, they look to these preachers and they see preachers dressed, in these fancy sneakers. There's an Instagram account called, I think, Preachers and Sneakers, and it's photographs of preachers with their Yeezys and their expensive Nike, $1,000 Nikes, and their fancy clothes. I mean, I think a lot of us think that clerics should take a vow of poverty. They shouldn't give. They should dress simply. They shouldn't live in fancy houses. But I think that ties into the entrepreneurial culture, where it's, I think in our country we do worship rich. we worship rich people. We aspire to be like them, and when you braid that with a biblical message that you have wealth coming to you because you're giving us a donation, and that seed will grow into something special and something wonderful that you've been wanting, something material and not just spiritual. And that's a really powerful message.
Yeah. Now, as part of your work, you mentioned that you visited a number of different churches, evangelical churches.
Right.
And it should be noted that you also point out that you were very warmly received, pretty consistently.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get to talk to any of the folks, churchgoers, that of what the attraction was? I know it was probably different, very different churches, but for example, what draws them to someone like a Robert Jeffress, for example?
Yeah, I went to 9 different evangelical churches, all different sizes, mega churches as well as storefront churches. I tried to, cover the gamut of some different denominations and some that are not denominational. And, and I would talk just informally with people, probably, 50 or so people in total. And just, I would get there early and try to get a sense of the place. And I would just say, so what, just the same question you asked, Corey, what brings you here? Why do you keep coming back? And almost universally, the answer was the community. They find a community here. And that's what evangelicals do so well. They really make you feel welcome. You go to these churches, and there's a welcome desk. And there's signs that say, "We're glad you're here." At Saddleback, I saw that. And there's always someone there, and you go there, and they take it. If you want to take a tour of the campus, you can. They give you tchotchkes, like a cup or a cooler or
fresh baked cookies.
Yeah, they give you they have, some of these places have coffee bars that are like Starbucks. They're amazing. It's not just an air pot of coffee. It's like they're making actual coffee drinks from scratch. So they're very good at that, and they're very good at getting people connected. The days of the baskets, where the collections are taken, those are long gone. I didn't see one basket in my voyages. You can download an app, and you can give your tithing through your app, or it's all automated. They're high tech. They're entertaining. The musicianship is outstanding. There's lighting. I mean, it's almost like going to a
Broadway show.
Exactly, like a Broadway show. It's theater style seating in a lot of cases, and a lot of people were surprised too when I said, some of these churches, there were no crosses, there's no statues of Jesus, there's no stained glass windows, and you could be walking into a convention center, and then that's on purpose because they don't want to turn people off. When you run a business, the largest market are the people who don't buy your product, so they want to appeal to the unchurched people as much as possible, and that's why they've been able to grow. These churches are so growth oriented that they don't want people to feel confused when they go to a service. And if you go to a Catholic service, there's all these prayers that people are saying, and if you've never been there, you don't know what they're saying. And then there's times you kneel and times you stand up, and then the genuflecting. And it's in a lot of these churches I went to, it was I didn't feel like I was lost, and it was. They were and then the messages from the pastors are very down to earth, how to be a good dad, and and how to be a better husband, and just very simple everyday messages, and that they really tried to speak to people in the common vernacular instead of talking about complex theological questions. So I found I found them very very welcoming, and but like you must have read my blog post where it's like, I'm a white middle-aged man, who's heterosexual, and I am a person of faith. So I have to reckon with that and say, well, if I was not those things, then maybe I wouldn't feel so comfortable. Maybe I wouldn't have been welcomed as well as I was. So, you do have to take stock of that.
I have a theory about that, and it's based on personal experience. Are you interested in my theory?
Yeah.
So I think oftentimes if you're someone who looks different or comes from a different background, there is, at least on the front end, an enthusiastic, warm embrace. But what I found over the long term, because I came from a Jewish background, I grew up in a very observant family and became a Christian in my late 20s. So when folks at my new church, I was going to an evangelical church called Grace Baptist here, about, 2,000 or 3,000 people would attend, over the course of four or five services every weekend. And what I found was I became everybody's token Jew. It's like we won one for Jesus, kind of thing. And similarly, I have on a very small sample size, African-American friends who went to that church, who experienced something similar. You do see a lot of white faces at that particular church, and also at a lot of the kinds of churches that you're describing. But it's almost like it's kind of like how Trump, he finds one black face in the crowd, and where's my? And it's hard for me to even use the language, but But you become the token in a way.
Right. Yeah. That I could see that. And, I live in San Diego, so it's a very diverse community. So, these churches were not all white, and there's one church in particular is the Rock Church. It's probably the largest mega church in San Diego County. It was started by Miles McPherson, who was a former San Diego Charger.
Okay.
He's still the top pastor there. And I interviewed him. So he's African American, and the service I went to, it looked like going to a Padres. It was like going to a Padres game. It was
wow.
It was a lot of different ages, and people dressed very casually, and a good racial mix as well. So and I would say largely the churches were white that I went to. The congregations I went to were white, but not totally. I mean, there was some more diversity than I think people would expect. Who aren't familiar with or they just know evangelicals as as some kind of political term, but if they actually went to a service, I think they probably would have been surprised by how diverse it was.
Did you talk to folks at the churches that you went to about some of the political issues? For example, I'm curious if you talk to folks in an all-white church about things like Black Lives Matter or critical race theory, and if it was any different at a church like McPherson's in San Diego that is more culturally and racially diverse.
I did notice some difference. That's a very astute question. Where Miles McPherson felt like that he thinks that politics should be de-emphasized. He thinks that evangelicals have become too fixated on politics. which is interesting. And then, but there's another church I went to in San Diego. It's a Southern Baptist convention church, and the pastor was extremely hard-edged politically. And I sat with some. It was a largely white congregation. I sat next to some people. I talked to them before the service and just about kind of their religious background. And the pastor delivered a sermon that was essentially saying that liberals are evil. And talking about the dangers of critical race theory, and they want to stop us from having a meeting here, and or having a congregation. And I spoke with the people I sat to afterwards, and I said, boy, I really felt like that was inappropriate to call a group of people evil because they believe in something, a different political perspective. And the people answered, well, they are trying to take this away from us. And I said, who's they?
Who's they?
So I walked in here, nobody stopped me from. There's a couple thousand people here. Like I don't see any anybody barring our entry. But I think some evangelicals do have a siege mentality of that they're always under attack and they're always under assault, and especially from the mainstream culture. And I did hear some talk about critical race theory, and so these are people that pick up these messages, I think, on Fox News and on Facebook and social media, and they do feel like that their way of life is under attack, and that goes pretty deep into evangelical history. This feeling of being under assault, and in some ways that's justified. There was a sense, especially in the 30s and 40s and 50s, mainline Protestants looked down on evangelicals, and even if evangelicals looked down on Pentecostals, as snake handlers, and that these were people speaking in tongues, and that's not something that you should do. So there is that siege mentality that exists for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. You point to it's been going on for a long time. There was one account early in the book where you're talking about the Scopes trial, and I guess I didn't realize that the play was accurate to where in the play
Inherit
the Wind,
Mm-hmm.
where that character, the William Jennings Bryan character, like has a heart attack and basically dies right there.
Right.
I didn't realize that William Jennings Bryan actually died a few days after.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
He you account at I guess it was funeral or a memorial service. A lot of folks there were talking. They were speaking about the evils of journalism and science and academic experience, and we're still talking about that now.
We're still talking about that, and the battle over textbooks and in school. I mean, that trial was again almost 100 years ago, and we're still fighting about what are we teaching our children? Why are we teaching our children about the critical race theory, or why are we teaching our children about evolution? We should be teaching them about creationism too. And the battles were really intense in the 70s and as well. So it's like these cycles just continue to repeat, and it is surprising how little we seem to advance from the past.
So fast forward to the 50s, I didn't realize how explicitly anti-segregation and how averse I'm talking about Jerry Falwell Sr.
Yeah,
how averse he was to civil rights leaders like Dr. King. I didn't realize how explicit he was about that. He, on the one hand, he did. I think you quoted him in your section on your chapter on culture. What's the name of the chapter again at the end of the book? Culture
Clash.
Yeah, Culture Clash. Yeah. Where the two quotes, where in 65 he says basically leave politics alone, but by 1980 he's all in. But I didn't realize even having that stance in the mid 60s, he was still pretty explicitly anti-segregation.
Yeah, that was something that surprised me too. I mean, Jerry Falwell was a son of the rural Virginia, so he grew up in a segregated community. Back then the churches were all white that he was in. And I think there was a sense that that quote you mentioned from 1965, the context of that is he was responding to the Bloody Sunday in Selma in 1965, the struggle for, that John Lewis was attacked and other civil rights marchers were attacked to press for voting rights in Selma. And Falwell's attitude is, well, preachers should not be involved in politics at all.
Get out of the streets, I think he said.
Get out of the streets. They need to focus on, people's individual relationship with Jesus. That's what pastors do. They should not be involved in all these social problems. And then his attitude changed 180 degrees by the late 70s, where he was getting involved with these anti-gay legislation, and he started the Moral Majority and got explicitly involved in partisan politics. And I think there was a sense that they didn't want these churches felt like they should not be told how to run their enterprises. They should be. Government shouldn't tell them what to do. And so a lot of these churches responded to the civil rights movement by opening up what they called segregation academies. And these were all white schools in the 60s. And that was their direct response to the civil rights movement of the 60s is we're going to set up our own schools. And that's that. And they started them by the thousands into the 60s. And then these churches ran into trouble in the 70s because the IRS looked at that and said, well, we'll take away your tax exemption if you refuse to admit any non-white students. And that became a real battle in the 70s. That was one of the things that led Falwell and others to be involved more explicitly in politics, because they blamed the Carter administration for that, even though that started under Nixon and was continued under Ford. They blamed Carter for pursuing that, and they felt like that was an infringement on their religious liberty, that they're being told what to do, and they didn't feel like that was right.
Yeah. It does make me wonder. I think a lot of folks that I go to church with might look at those accounts of how Falwell was back in the 50s and maybe look at it with a critical eye and say, well, hopefully he evolved on race, because we're certainly not there now. But in a way, we are there now. And I just wonder if we're able to recognize the ways that we are contextualizing or recontextualizing issues. And we've mentioned a couple, Black Lives Matter, for example, or critical race theory, that we're perpetuating some of the same proclivities that it's easier for us to see in a Jerry Falwell 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we look back at history and say, well, that we wouldn't do that. That these people are right. Those people were racist, or they were sexist, or they were, and I think that we need to take stock of how we really are, and that those strains still exist today, and we have to be humble and not think that we're somehow superior to people in the past, because those elements are still with us, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I found really interesting was how media or platforms were really utilized by what you call evangelical entrepreneurs. Could you describe for us a little bit about like the advent of radio, for example, and then when TV came on the picture, so to speak? Could you describe some of that evolution and how that's influenced how figures have come into view?
Sure. Yeah. So evangelicals were really the stars of the radio era, of the 20s and 30s. I write about Amy Semple McPherson in Los Angeles. So she founded her own church in Los Angeles. She owned a radio station. She was the first female, or first American woman, I think, to own a radio station. So this is in the early 1920s, and so she owned the station. She operated out of her church, and she was a radio pastor, and she gained a huge audience from that, and then others of that era were fundamentalists, were among the most popular people on the radio back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think what evangelicals were able to do, fundamentalists they were mostly called back then, is they just were able to connect with people in an individual way through the radio. Radio is such an intimate form of communication, and they just were really adept at connecting people. And you read, I've read some letters from people just talking about how they just felt like that this preacher was sitting in their living room, and they just felt a connection they'd never felt before. Maybe they may have been old or unable to go to a church, or they lived too far away from a church, and it really was a lifeline for people. And then as you got into the television era in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was even more that way. It was even more intimate, and this person is actually in your living room. Oral Roberts or Billy Graham, people like that, and evangelicals were willing to take chances on new media, new forms of media, more so than the more mainline Protestant churches. They're just more willing. They're more willing to just work within the bounds of what they have. Where I think evangelicals are more willing to, to fulfill the Great Commission. You want to spread your message as widely as possible. That's such a big element of evangelicalism, and they saw radio and television, and now the internet is a way to do that. Social media. They're, like I said, they during the pandemic they had services through Zoom or through their websites or through their apps, through Twitter, YouTube. I mean, they were very quick at adapting to the new reality, and where you see other churches not so much. And so these churches are just so growth oriented, and they want to find the largest audience they can, and media is the way to do it.
Yeah. Now we mentioned this briefly a second ago, and the chapter titled "Culture Clash." So there was a 180-degree shift in Jerry Falwell Sr. regarding his involvement in politics between 65 and 80. What were some of the things that shifted for him personally and that drove these growing movements, like the moral majority that he founded later?
Yeah, one of them was what I mentioned about the IRS scrutinizing churches for having segregated academies. That was an element of it, that they felt like they were under assault from the government. Another thing was there was some Supreme Court rulings about school prayer that a lot of evangelicals didn't like in the 60s, and then you had Roe versus Wade in 73. Although that was not a big issue for evangelicals at the time. It was interesting. I looked at the newspaper coverage of that whole week, and I tried to find quotes from because the Catholic Church was very much against abortion at that time, and they had been fighting against decriminalization efforts in California and in New York. But
I didn't realize that LBJ died that day.
Yeah, that was one of the issues, is that Lyndon Johnson died and sort of blew that off the front page, and then there was the Paris peace talks with the war in Vietnam, which was an enormous story that week as well. So it was interesting. Where Roe versus Wade was actually probably the third most covered story of that week, but there was the reaction from the evangelical world was very muted about abortion in 1973. And I think as time went on, I think that they started realizing that this is an issue that maybe we can align with Catholics and work in the Republican Party, and then combine it with there was the spread of pornography in the 70s. That was an important issue, and then the efforts against gay rights also was tied into that. So I think they started seeing some of these cultural issues could be useful in the political realm in the 70s. So that there was it took some years, but I think by the end of the 70s there was a sense that that evangelicals need to be involved in politics. They need to get involved in these issues that are coming up. And then with the rise of Reagan, it was a perfect meeting of two forces that came together.
Yeah, and then culturally too, you deal a lot with some of the hallmarks of evangelicalism and how it ended up being closely aligned with the Republican Party. Could you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I think historically, evangelicalism is almost inherently conservative in their outlook. Individualistic, and very suspicious of government action, suspicious of collective action, suspicious of unions, very patriotic, pro-American. The American exceptionalism was a really strong theme of Billy Graham in the 50s and the Eisenhower era, that we're an exceptional nation chosen by God to fight against the godless communists of Russia in the 50s and 60s. So those strains that were there with the Billy Sunday era as well in the 20s. I think when it really was the Falwell in the 70s and into the 80s where it became explicitly partisan and party affiliated. If you look at 1976, the presidential election, you had Jimmy Carter. He was the first evangelical. He was Southern Baptist, running against Gerald Ford, who I think he's a mainline Protestant. He's not evangelical. So that's such an interesting thing, because the evangelical vote pretty much split in half. Half voted for Ford, half voted for Carter. And then you go to 1980, and then Carter is on the ballot again, but he's running against Ronald Reagan, and he's much less Carter is much less popular, and Reagan gets 2/3 of the evangelical vote. That's such an interesting passage of time, that 76 to 80, and that's when Falwell was really getting involved in politics. And I think that's when the Republican Party realized that if we can align with these evangelicals and some ethnic Catholics in Reagan Democrat, what they became known as Reagan Democrats, we can pull away a lot of Democratic support from Carter, and it worked.
So you described some conservative principles, small government, fiscal conservative, things like that. So here's the big question: what did evangelicals see in Trump?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and that's another question I got a lot from friends and family. Like, how can these people who are so biblically centered, how can they support someone like Trump, who has such a history of bad behavior? He's been divorced twice. He doesn't seem too familiar with the contents of the Bible.
2 Corinthians.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and I think he actually said that
at Falwell's place,
Liberty University, and there were some chuckles in the audience because this was early on. I interviewed, you mentioned Robert Jeffress earlier, and he's the pastor of a mega church in Dallas, 10,000 members at least. He has a radio program. He's on Fox News quite a lot. He's a very prominent pastor, and I said, well, so it's 2015, and you've got Trump running, and Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and so why do you choose to support Trump? Jeffress was one of the first evangelical leaders to campaign for Trump, actually, during the primaries in 2016. And he just said, Jeffress said, well, I just felt like Trump had the best chance to beat Hillary Clinton. It was just a pure political calculation.
A calculation, yeah. And Trump says that pretty overtly too, that it's a transactional relationship.
Yeah, and Jeffress actually used that phrase too. He said it's politics. It's a transactional relationship. We got something from Trump, and that's how politics works. So it's I think they did. I'm not sure Trump was the number one choice of evangelicals in the primaries, but I think as it became clear that Trump was going to be the nominee, evangelicals rallied around him because they just saw that, okay, it's going to be Trump, and we're going to have to hold our noses. And Trump is smart in that he understood that he had to have the support of evangelicals to win the nomination and then win the election. There's no way to win the nomination in the Republican Party if you do not have the support of evangelicals. And he was very close to a woman named Paula White, who's a mega church leader in Florida. And the story of how he connected with her is very in keeping with Trump. He was flipping around the TV station one night, flipping around the channels one night, and he came across Paula White, who's a petite blonde woman and very good on television. He was just captivated by her and her message. She's a prosperity gospel preacher, which ties into some of the Trump ideas, and she became his spiritual advisor. So this is even before he was a candidate for president. And when he won, she was as close to Trump as probably Billy Graham was to Richard Nixon. I mean, in terms of the White House years. I mean, she was in the Oval Office quite a lot. She was head of a committee, a faith-based committee. So he knew he needed to show that he had the support of evangelicals, and I think I spoke to Jeffress. He said Donald Trump delivered. He gave us 3 Supreme Court justices.
Yeah.
And he supports religious liberty, and he's good on our issues. And so I think it's a bargain that they made, and we'll see if they're going to make it again. I don't know.
Well, yeah. So depending on what poll you're looking at, what survey, between 77 and 81% of white evangelicals supported him in 2020, and still strongly do.
Yeah.
So you were doing some of your research for the book when the insurrection on January 6th happened. What were some of the reactions you heard from various leading figures in the evangelical world?
Yeah, I didn't write too much about it because I didn't. Except that I had handed the manuscript last fall, so I didn't want to get too deep into it because it was still a little unclear as to what the forces were behind it. The commission hadn't really started yet. The House committee studying the January 6th, so I didn't talk about it too much in the book. But I would say it didn't seem to dent evangelical support for Trump much at all. If you look at the polling. It seemed it's been pretty steady, even after that, and even after the revelations of the committee. There's still Trump has not lost his core support, that at least for polling. And like I say, we'll have to see if he decides to run again, and if Ron DeSantis runs, or if some other maybe someone like Ron DeSantis might get more support from evangelicals. I think we'll just have to see.
If Trump doesn't run, my prediction is Marjorie Taylor Greene's going to be running for president.
Well, I was reading a story about her the other day, and she was saying, there's rumors that Trump might pick her as his running mate next time.
Yeah.
It won't be Mike Pence.
I heard an interesting theory from Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer. He was his lawyer for over a decade, and he said Trump's not running. He knows Trump better than just about anybody. He said Trump's not running. The reason is that the grift will be over. He's making more money now than he ever has before, because he's able to get, his super PAC or whatever. He's able to get hundreds of millions of dollars that way.
Yeah, I think the counter argument to that would be, though, if the day that Donald Trump says he's not running for president, that's when a lot of the attention goes away. Because it's like, well, he's not running, and he would still be involved, I'm sure. But when you're not a candidate, I think you would lose a lot of the attention, and he craves that attention, and he craves that. But he may be afraid that he might lose. So there's that too.
So a couple more questions. So you deal a lot with some of the contemporary mega churches. Saddleback is one of them. Have you some things you did talk about Rick Warren discussing his retirement, and always saying the 40-year mark, I think, was when he was going to retire. But this last June, he actually did step down. And he was replaced by Andy Wood. Have you followed with any of those developments, by the way?
No, I haven't. I've followed it just from reading about it in the press. But I think that's going to be interesting to watch that transition, because it's one of the things with these evangelical entrepreneurs is that you often have, just like with any business, the founder of the business is usually a very driven person who started something Rick Warren started from nothing, and he built one of the largest churches in the country, and he has one of the best-selling books ever been printed. And I think it's hard for a lot of these people to step aside and see it go to somebody else. And I think Rick Warren probably has the discipline to do that, and I think he understands that, sort of that business principle where you shouldn't choose your successor. You shouldn't hand it off to your son or your wife or something. You should have another neutral party select your successor, which is what he did. So it'll be interesting to see how Saddleback evolves after Warren, because he had been senior pastor for 42 years, I think.
So if I can make a recommendation, there's an excellent investigative journalist named Julie Roys, Roys. And her particular beat, she's been tracking with a number of up and coming pastors of mega churches. and others in ministry. She's an evangelical. I believe that Julie identifies as an evangelical. But she did a profile on Andy Wood. It turns out that there are numerous credible charges of abuse along the lines of Mark Driscoll, famous from Mars Hill and Mars Hill's demise. So, but look up. She's an excellent journalist.
I'll read that.
So, so some of these charges, some of this came out after Saddleback hired Andy, and they said they did an internal investigation. But the way that they did an investigation about these charges was using the search firm. The very search firm they used to find him in the first place, the search firm is the one that did the investigation to figure out if there was any merit to these charges. So it's,
that's going to be very interesting to watch, and that's something that churches have had a difficult time with transparency. You know, they have a hard time investigating themselves. If you're familiar with Willow Creek Church,
sure. I was going to ask you, Bill Hybels.
Bill Hybels is a great, and he was on a very a parallel track with Rick Warren for a lot of their careers. They got started around the same time, and very similar business-oriented approaches. And they both had consultancies that trained other pastors and churches to basically follow their model of church growth. And he was also the founding pastor of this church, and there were sexual misconduct allegations against him, and the church investigated it, and it was a botched investigation, and he was very defensive. There was a report, investigative series in the Chicago Tribune about that, and he was very defensive when those stories came out, and then ultimately he stepped aside. And I tried really hard to find him, and I could not find Bill Hybels. I read his books, and I wrote about him in my book, and I could not find the man. So I don't know what he's doing now, but he was a really important leader in the evangelical world. I actually went to Willow Creek as part of this book to go to a service, and I think what's happening to that church is also very interesting too, because that was one of the largest church. I think that was the largest church in the country, and 15, 20 years ago, and he would have these meetings. He would have these big meetings with Bill Clinton and Bill Gates, and he was a real kind of a big shot, and then it all went away. And so I went to the church, and it was just. I mean, it was a church. It was a footprint that was far too big for what the church is today. I mean, it really looks like an office park. You drive up there, and there's acres of parking lots, and then this church. It looks like a convention center, and you go in, and it had to have been a 1/10 full. I mean, it was just really, really interesting. And it was summer, so people don't go to church as much in the summer. But I just felt like, wow, this church really needs to think about its future, because it can't go back to the way it was, I don't think.
Yeah, you talk about the Crystal Cathedral and how it's being repurposed. And,
now it's a Catholic cathedral.
Right.
Catholic Church bought it.
Total coincidence. I passed by the that early. What's the name of the lady that you mentioned before? The charismatic radio.
Amy Semple McPherson. Yeah.
I just so happened to pass by that church.
It's at Echo Park. Yeah.
When I saw it, the only reason I recognized it because I read your book.
Oh, and I have a picture of it. It hasn't changed much in
not much
100 years from the outside. Yeah. And it's in Echo Park and in LA. Yeah.
It's so funny because I wouldn't have taken note of it otherwise, but I saw this rounded sort of Coliseum-like building. Oh, that's the church he's talking about.
That's cool.
But I was curious, what do you think are some of the causes? It's an all too frequent fall from grace type story of these evangelical leaders. What do you think are some of the causes of that?
I think a lot of it is, a lot of these churches are husband and wife operations, or they're family operations. So there's a lot of there's not a lot of independent scrutiny, and also they don't have to report their they don't have to fill out certain IRS forms like other nonprofits do, and I think it's a real temptation to use the church's finances for your own purposes, and I think the lines between the church and your personal life are non-existent. You are the church, and there's no dividing line. Just like a lot of businesses, if you run your own business, sometimes it's hard to know what the line is between your personal finances and your business finances. It blur. It's a very blurry line. I think that's an issue, and I think it's like I say that there's a real succession problem, and we really saw that with the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County, where you have a very strong-minded person who founded this church again out of nothing. He didn't have a church when he moved out to California. He had services at a drive-in movie theater, and there wasn't actually a church that he worked out of for lots of years. And so he built this beautiful cathedral and this campus, and the Hour of Power television show that a lot of people of a certain age might remember. It was probably the most popular radio or television program, religious television program for years. And you didn't want to step aside, he got older, and he just didn't want to let go of the reins. And I think, and then he finally did. And I interviewed his son, Robert Schuller, and he just, his son described, that you look around the board, and it's their in-laws, his wife was on the board, and there was just a lot of self-dealing and not a lot of financial control. So Schuller's son tried to instill, accounting practices that are, normal for nonprofits, and the rest of the family didn't want that. They liked it the way it was. They had nice salaries. They had all the benefits that you could ever want. And then Schuller's son got pushed out, and now the church went into bankruptcy, and now they had to sell off the campus to the Catholic Church of all things. So it's just that succession problem is a real issue for these churches and these ministries. And we've seen it with Jerry Falwell Jr. He's had plenty of issues. So it's I think it's just that there just is there's no independent structure, for these churches. I think when they're just their husband and wife operations and their family operations, I think that's where they run into problems.
Yeah. Well, listen, I really enjoyed the book. It's a super, super enjoyable read. It reads, if folks enjoy good journalism and good writing, but also in particular on the subject matter, I can't recommend it highly enough. It is Soul Winners, the Ascent of, I'm reading upside down. So wait, I'm trying to do it in the camera so we can get a shot of it. Soul Winners, the Ascent of America's Evangelical Entrepreneurs. The author is David Clary. So David, what's next for you?
Well, I'm one of my passions in life is also baseball. So I'm thinking my next book will be baseball related. I'm not quite sure how it's going to be shaped, but I've always wanted to write a book about baseball. I have some ideas, but I need to do a lot more thinking and research before I know exactly what I'm doing.
So I'm guessing that I figured in football, you're like a Buffalo Bills fan, right? From Central New York.
Yeah. I have a tortured history with the NFL because I moved to Cleveland right after the Browns left town for Baltimore.
Okay. Yeah.
So there was a couple year void there where there was no team, and then the Browns came back and they were terrible. And then I moved to San Diego, and I tried to be a Chargers. I tried hard to be a Chargers fan, yeah. And they had some great players in my first few years here, and then we want a new stadium, and then they moved to Los Angeles. So now I would say, I'd say I'm just going to go back to my roots and just hope that the Buffalo Bills stay in Buffalo and don't move to Toronto or something like that.
So who do you follow in baseball?
I'm a Yankees fan.
Just stop. I'm not publishing this. No, we don't need to talk anymore. How did you become a Yankees?
Well, I grew up in Central New York, so
it's
Yankee country, and it was difficult the years I was in Cleveland because people in Cleveland hate the Yankees. So I stood firm. Those were the glory years.
The people in Cleveland have character, of course.
Yeah.
Now, just give you credit.
Well, Cleveland had wonderful teams back then too, but the Yankees were always
right.
They had, they were loaded, and the Yankees were just a little bit better, just like the way that the Astros are just a little bit better than the Yankees right now.
Yeah.
So I take it you're a Dodgers fan?
No. Oh. I'm a Mets fan, diehard Mets fan.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I grew up. The first game I went to, I think it was like 76 or so. My Aunt Rhoda and Uncle Jerry took me and my brother to Shea Stadium, Old Shea. Oh. And it was a game that there was a pre-game exhibition, and it was the Mets wives playing a softball game against the cast of Happy Days. So I got my picture with the Fonz, and
wow, you don't get more 70s than that. That's
Seaver was still on the team.
Oh wow.
But obviously the next year, but as a teenager, the Mets were really fun to follow. The 84, 85, 86.
86 year. Yeah, that was the last World Series championship.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, the 2000 was I remember that World Series very well.
2015 were decent seasons. Yeah. This season, the regular season, was a great season.
Yeah, I like the Padres. I live in San Diego, so I follow the Padres really closely, and I was like, oh my god, the Padres are going to get steamrolled by the Mets because they have such great starting pitching, and they're going to.
I was worried about that series because the Padres really handled them very well. It was one of the few teams that won series against the Mets in the regular season.
That's true. Yeah, the best of 3 series. I mean, anything can happen. I mean, it's such a fluky. Like Scherzer had a series. Scherzer gave up 4 home runs, and I was, you're already down. You're almost dead. You just need one more win, and then you're.
Baseball will be baseball. You give me Scherzer and DeGrom in a 3 games, starting the first 2 games of a 3-game series, I'll take it every time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So my heart is breaking still. Okay. Last question. How can we find you online? Where can we find the book and all the other great work that you're doing?
Oh yeah. So I have my own website, and I post a blog there, and there's an excerpt of the book and some a little bit more about me. It's David Clary author. DavidClaryAuthor.com.
Yeah. And I'll be sure to put it in the show notes and stuff. So yeah. And again, that'll be in the show notes. Okay. And this was really great. It was great. I'm so grateful for to have been able to read the book and learned a lot more about this history. And it's really insightful. It's a great read.
Thank you.
So and it's cool. It's like, this is one of the coolest things about doing this thing is that I'd be reading these books anyway, and now I get to hang out with the guy who wrote it. So
yeah, and then I get
really cool.
I get to follow your journey too, because I wasn't aware of your podcast until a few months ago. Now I'm like, oh no, I have another podcast I can listen to, and another person I can follow on Twitter who's smart and interesting. And, and these issues that I'm so fascinated about. So it's great for me too.
That's awesome. Well, I really appreciate that. And, we'll have to if I come down your way, I'll let you know, and we'll maybe take in a Padres game or something.
Sounds good.
So all right.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Corey. I really appreciate you having me on and taking the time to read the book and
you bet.
Thoughtful.
It truly was my pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about TPNR. We are easier to recommend than ever. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. That's make sure to put in the www.politicsandreligion.us. And don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you dig what we're doing here, it is super easy to follow us. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.us. That's with the "and" spelled out, A-N-D. Politicsandreligion.us. And we're on all the socials at TP and R Pod. TP and R Pod for Talking Politics and Religion Pod. And here's a big way you can support us: by becoming one of our patrons. You can even become a producer or executive producer of our program and have a lot more say in who we bring on, the kinds of questions we explore, or just help us keep the lights on. But mostly, we really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for the whole team here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for hanging out with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.